What happens when two top predators want the same resource, but neither can afford a mistake? In nature, conflict is rarely driven by aggression alone. More often, it begins with pressure. Food availability drops, energy reserves shrink, movement patterns change. Suddenly, familiar ground no longer provides enough to survive. One hunter adapts by expanding its range, pushing farther each day, reading signs left behind by others. Another maintains control through presence, relying on size and reputation to limit competition. Neither intends to fight, both intend to endure. But survival is not shaped by intention, it is shaped by necessity. When paths begin to overlap, tension builds long before teeth or claws are involved. Every signal matters. Every response carries meaning. The smallest miscalculation can escalate into irreversible consequence. This is not a story about strength versus weakness. It is about decision-making under pressure. Because in the wild, encounters are not decided in moments of violence, but in the seconds leading up to them, when instinct, experience, and restraint collide. Tonight, we examine how risk is measured, how boundaries are tested, and why walking away can be as decisive as standing ground. Pressure in nature does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates. Seasonal shifts alter movement patterns across the landscape. Prey density changes. Feeding success becomes inconsistent. What once sustained life with reliability now demands greater effort for diminishing returns. As resources decline, animals are forced to reassess familiar routines. Established paths no longer provide enough. Safe distances grow shorter. Decisions that once favored conservation must now prioritize opportunity. This environment does not reward comfort. It rewards adjustment. Predators respond differently to scarcity. Some increase mobility, expanding their range and accepting greater exposure to risk. Others reinforce control over productive zones, relying on presence and deterrence rather than pursuit. Neither approach is inherently aggressive. Both are responses to constraint. Terrain amplifies pressure. Snow alters footing and visibility. Wind disrupts scent trails. Cover becomes unreliable. Each environmental factor reduces margin for error. In these conditions, avoidance becomes increasingly difficult. Overlapping routes are no longer coincidental, they are inevitable outcomes of compression. As available space shrinks, tolerance erodes. Signals appear long before conflict. Tracks intersect. Scents linger longer than expected. Feeding sites show signs of repeated visitation. Each indicator communicates presence, intent, and resistance. The environment records everything. Energy expenditure becomes a central concern. Every movement must justify its cost. Chasing without outcome weakens even the strongest animals. Standing ground without cause wastes reserves needed for survival. Pressure transforms calculation. What begins as adaptation gradually becomes confrontation potential, not because predators seek dominance, but because conditions no longer permit separation. The land does not guide choices, it limits them. And when limitation replaces flexibility, encounters become a matter of timing rather than desire. The first predator responds to pressure through assessment rather than force. Its survival depends on interpreting patterns, not overpowering resistance. Movement is efficient, rarely wasted. Routes are chosen based on probability rather than habit. This hunter reads subtle indicators: disturbed ground, altered prey behavior, residual scent carried by wind. Each clue contributes to an evolving internal map. Unlike larger competitors, this predator cannot absorb damage. Injury limits mobility, and reduced mobility eliminates options. As a result, restraint becomes a survival mechanism. Risk is never ignored, it is managed. When resources decline, expansion becomes necessary. Familiar territory no longer provides sufficient return. The hunter moves outward, testing boundaries incrementally, withdrawing at the first sign of unacceptable threat. Distance is protection. Speed is contingency. Awareness is constant. This predator does not challenge directly. It observes response. A pause. A shift in posture. A change in breathing rhythm. These details matter more than physical confrontation. Hunger alters calculation but does not erase discipline. Even under pressure, decisions remain conditional. Engagement is never absolute. Retreat is always preserved as an option. This approach does not signal weakness. It reflects optimization. However, expansion introduces exposure. Each unfamiliar route increases chance of detection. Each successful find leaves evidence. Avoidance becomes harder the farther the hunter travels from known ground. Eventually, presence is acknowledged. At this stage, the hunter must choose between persistence and withdrawal. Opportunity may exist, but confirmation requires proximity. Proximity increases danger. This predator understands that survival favors those who leave before advantage disappears. But scarcity complicates judgment. What was once an unacceptable risk becomes tolerable. What was once avoidable becomes necessary. The hunter does not seek dominance. It seeks access. And in an environment where access is restricted, calculation alone may no longer prevent confrontation. The second predator responds to pressure through control rather than expansion. Its advantage is not adaptability, but authority built over time. Size alters behavior. Where smaller hunters must negotiate risk, this animal enforces boundaries through presence alone. Movement is slower, but deliberate. Energy is conserved until action becomes unavoidable. This predator does not patrol continuously. Instead, it relies on predictability, familiar feeding areas, established travel routes, and repeated success. These patterns reduce uncertainty and limit the need for constant vigilance. Control is maintained through reputation. Few competitors test these limits directly. Most retreat before contact, preserving energy and avoiding injury. Over time, this reinforces territorial stability. However, stability depends on consistency. When external pressure increases, patterns begin to fail. Feeding opportunities diminish. Intrusions become frequent. Deterrence alone loses effectiveness. Energy economics shift. Responding to every disturbance is inefficient. Ignoring repeated incursions risks loss of access. The predator must balance response with restraint, a calculation influenced by experience rather than urgency. This animal is built for short, decisive actions. Prolonged engagement drains reserves quickly. Speed is costly, recovery is slow. Injury threatens long-term survival. Despite these constraints, authority remains valuable. As signs of intrusion accumulate, tolerance decreases. What once went unchallenged now requires acknowledgement. The predator adjusts posture, positioning itself more visibly. Presence becomes a signal. This is not aggression, it is reinforcement. The predator understands that dominance must be demonstrated periodically, not through pursuit, but through readiness. When challenged, it responds not to chase, but to discourage. Yet pressure alters judgment. Increased frequency of disturbance shortens decision windows. Fatigue compounds irritation. Certainty erodes. Eventually, recognition replaces routine. Another hunter is operating within controlled space. And while this predator does not seek confrontation, it understands that unchecked access threatens long-term stability. Control must be reasserted or risk gradual loss. Escalation begins without contact. Long before physical engagement, information is exchanged. Movement patterns intersect. Scents accumulate rather than fade. Feeding sites show signs of repeated use. Each indicator narrows uncertainty. These signals are not threats, they are measurements. The expanding hunter notes resistance, altered routes, increased visibility, presence where absence once existed. The controlling predator detects persistence incursions that do not retreat immediately. Both adjust behavior. Distance closes incrementally. Timing overlaps. Encounters become probable rather than accidental. At this stage, neither predator benefits from immediate withdrawal. Leaving forfeits access. Staying increases risk. Decision-making becomes reactive rather than planned. Energy investment rises. Vigilance replaces rest. Each moment spent monitoring reduces recovery time. Fatigue becomes a variable. The environment magnifies tension. Limited visibility restricts early detection. Wind disperses scent unpredictably. Terrain forces proximity. Signals intensify. Posture changes. Movement slows or accelerates without clear purpose. Orientation becomes direct rather than parallel. These cues communicate readiness without commitment. Still, violence is avoided. Both predators recognize that engagement carries irreversible consequence. Injury cannot be undone. Survival beyond the encounter matters more than immediate outcome. Yet tolerance has limits. Repeated signals lose effect. Presence becomes normalized. Deterrence weakens. Eventually, acknowledgement becomes unavoidable. Distance closes beyond comfort. Reaction time replaces calculation. Escalation is complete when avoidance no longer provides advantage. The next exchange will no longer be informational. It will be decisive. The encounter begins without movement. Both predators are aware of each other before either commits to action. Detection is immediate. Distance is short enough to remove uncertainty, but long enough to delay contact. This is where decision-making overtakes instinct. The expanding hunter reacts first, not with speed, but with positioning. Its body angle shifts to maintain escape options. Weight remains distributed for rapid change in direction. Attention is fixed, but motion is restrained. Across the open space, the territorial animal holds its ground. Its response is minimal. It does not advance. It does not retreat. This stillness is deliberate, a signal of control rather than hesitation. Neither predator benefits from initiating contact. The smaller hunter tests the boundary with lateral movement, not an approach, a measurement. The response is immediate. The larger animal adjusts orientation, reasserting line of control without closing distance. Information is exchanged. Reaction time is confirmed. Reach is assessed. Commitment thresholds are evaluated. The expanding hunter increases tempo briefly, then withdraws. This maneuver forces response without risking contact. The result is conclusive. Pursuit would be costly. Retaliation would be decisive. The territorial predator advances several steps, not to engage, but to reduce options. Space is compressed. Angles narrow. This is pressure, not aggression. The smaller hunter shifts again, this time closer. The distance now falls within danger range. The margin for error collapses. A sudden movement follows fast, direct, and incomplete. It is not an attack. It is a disruption. The goal is reaction, not damage. The territorial animal responds instantly. Weight shifts forward. Muscle engages. The ground absorbs impact as mass surges into motion. The advance stops just short of contact. The exchange is brief but expensive. Energy spikes. Breath deepens. Heat builds beneath thick muscle. For the larger predator, this is a warning investment. For the smaller one, it is confirmation. The expanding hunter withdraws rapidly, avoiding extension of the encounter. Timing is precise. A fraction of delay would eliminate escape. Both reassess. The territorial animal resumes control of space, advancing slowly, deliberately. Each step reduces access to the resource under dispute. This is not pursuit. It is exclusion. The smaller hunter circles again, now farther out. Speed remains available, but opportunity narrows. Every movement is tracked. Surprise is gone. At this stage, persistence becomes costly. Yet withdrawal carries its own consequence. Leaving now forfeits hard-earned access gained through risk. Another approach follows. This one is closer, more assertive. Teeth flash toward vulnerable areas without intent to connect. The signal is clear. Resistance will continue. The response is overwhelming. The territorial predator rises, expanding its profile, eliminating ambiguity. The display is not wasteful, but decisive. The sound carries. The message is absolute. This time, the smaller hunter retreats farther. The cost-benefit balance has shifted. The encounter does not escalate further. It stabilizes. Risk has been measured. Limits have been reached. What remains is choice. The outcome shifts not because of dominance, but because of accumulation. Energy expenditure reaches a threshold. The territorial predator remains in control, but the cost of continued response becomes apparent. Displays consume reserves. Recovery slows. The expanding hunter recognizes this, but also recognizes its own limitations. Escalation would require commitment without exit. That cost is unacceptable. Both predators arrive at the same conclusion through different calculations. Continued engagement offers diminishing returns. For the smaller hunter, the probability of access no longer outweighs the risk of injury. For the larger one, reinforcement has achieved its purpose. Control has been demonstrated. Further action is unnecessary. The encounter resolves through disengagement rather than defeat. Distance increases gradually. Orientation relaxes. Tension dissipates in stages rather than abruptly. Neither animal turns away immediately. Awareness remains high until separation is secured. This resolution is not passive, it is strategic. Each predator preserves future options by limiting present cost. Survival extends beyond the moment. The shift is subtle, but definitive. The resource remains controlled. The challenger withdraws. Memory replaces confrontation as the lasting outcome. In nature, resolution often favors restraint over escalation, not because aggression fails, but because endurance demands efficiency. The encounter ends without injury, yet its influence persists. Behavior adjusts, routes change, boundaries solidify. The system stabilizes temporarily. After separation, neither predator resumes normal behavior immediately. Movement remains cautious. Attention stays elevated. The environment is scanned repeatedly, not for threat, but for confirmation that the encounter has ended. For the territorial animal, control is reinforced through presence rather than action. It remains near the contested area longer than usual, reasserting occupation through routine movement. The message extends beyond the challenger. It becomes part of the landscape. For the expanding hunter, withdrawal does not mean abandonment. Instead, behavior shifts. Travel paths alter. Timing changes. The area is not forgotten, but reclassified. What follows is not avoidance, but recalibration. Memory replaces confrontation as the primary guide. The risk profile of the location increases. Opportunity is postponed rather than erased. Energy conservation becomes priority. The smaller hunter redirects effort toward lower resistance options. The larger predator reduces display frequency, returning gradually to baseline activity. No injuries dictate this change. No visible scars mark the outcome, yet the effects are measurable. Encounters influence territory boundaries without physical alteration. Pressure alone reshapes behavior. The environment adapts through repetition rather than violence. This is how dominance persists without constant enforcement. The interaction leaves behind a silent structure, an understanding established through proximity, restraint, and response. Future encounters may occur, but they will not begin from zero. The prior exchange defines the opening conditions. In ecosystems, history matters. Behavior is cumulative. Decisions are layered. What appears as a momentary standoff becomes a long-term adjustment, altering movement patterns long after the participants separate. The encounter ends, but its influence does not. This encounter is not a story of victory or defeat. It is a demonstration of calculation under pressure. Both predators survive not by overpowering the other, but by recognizing limits their own and those imposed by the environment. Instinct initiates awareness. Experience shapes response. Intelligence governs restraint. In nature, survival is rarely decided by single moments of aggression. More often, it is determined by the ability to disengage before cost exceeds value. Conflict does not require conclusion through force. It requires resolution. The expanding hunter preserves mobility. The territorial animal maintains control. Neither sacrifices future capability for immediate gain. This balance defines long-term success. Such encounters repeat across ecosystems, unseen and undocumented. They form the invisible framework that governs movement, access, and survival. What we observe is not chaos. but order maintained through choice. The wild is not ruled by constant violence, but by continuous evaluation. Each decision leaves a trace. Each restraint strengthens survival. This is the reality behind predator encounters. Not brutality, but judgment.